Earlier this month, Nepal became the latest South Asian country to dramatically overthrow its government, as protesters, particularly young or Gen Z ones, took to the streets en masse. The scenes of Nepalese government buildings set ablaze were reminiscent of other successful uprisings in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, during which protesters stormed the palaces of their leaders. Youth-led protests against corruption, poor economic opportunities and misgovernance have also been spreading in Southeast Asia too, in Indonesia, the Philippines and Timor-Leste. So in this video, we're going to explain this so-called South Asian Spring, its causes and consequences, and the role of Generation Z and social media. Dive deeper into politics with our magazine, Too Long. Yes, we made a real physical magazine. In the latest issue, we discuss if Europe can really defend itself, why people like Putin get away with it, and if we're observing the end of the American order. Find out more by clicking the link in the description. Nepalese politics has always been dramatic. In the 2000s alone, it experienced a royal massacre, a Maoist insurgency, a king who sought absolute power, and a revolution that overthrew the centuries-old monarchy. Even after the country became a democratic republic in 2008, there continued to be regular political instability, with 14 governments in 17 years. Regular Nepalese grew frustrated at corruption and mismanagement, seeing power as simply cycling through different parties that are ultimately all part of the same political elite, which they view as out of touch and unaccountable. Early in September, young Nepalese started a Nepo Kids trend on platforms like TikTok that sought to highlight the extravagant lifestyles of the children of prominent political figures. This followed a similar Nepo baby trend in the Philippines, which we'll come back to later, and also the resignation of the Mongolian Prime Minister amid online anger at his son's lavish lifestyle. The immediate trigger for the Nepalese protests was a decision by the government to ban 26 social media platforms, including Facebook, Snapchat and YouTube, nominally for their failure to register with authorities in line with a recent court ruling. The 4th of September ban sparked intense anger. It's worth remembering that the country of 30 million people is young, more than 56% are under 30, and has a high rate of social media use. Seen as an attempt to silence criticism, the ban brought tens of thousands out onto the streets on Monday the 8th of September as part of what was dubbed the Gen Z protests, frustrated at the ban but also channeling much deeper-rooted economic and political dissatisfaction. The protest escalated and saw protesters clash with police and security forces, which, using water cannons, tear gas and live ammunition, killed at least 19 protesters on that Monday. 14 of them aged 28 or younger. The government's hasty lifting of the social media ban on Monday night failed to quell protests, which had intensified amid public outrage at the killings, and on Tuesday the 9th of September, major unrest spread, as protesters set fire to the Nepalese parliament and similarly attacked government buildings and the homes of political leaders around the country, some of whom were found and assaulted by those on the street. Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli announced his resignation that same day. Across the 2 days of unrest, at least 73 people lost their lives. And after calm had largely been restored by the end of the 9th of September, the country's army chief and usually ceremonial president entered into negotiations with representatives from the largely leaderless youth protest movement. The young activists had used the online platform Discord to debate their next steps and agreed to endorse former Supreme Court Chief Justice Sushila Karki, who had expressed solidarity with the protests as an interim Prime Minister. 73-year-old Karki was sworn in on the 12th of September and set fresh elections for March 2026. Now, as we said in the introduction, scenes from Nepal bore a striking similarity to Sri Lanka's 2022 uprising, which saw the powerful Rajapaksa family driven from office as protesters stormed the presidential palace, and from Bangladesh in 2024, when protesters ousted long-ruling Sheikh Hasina, whose residence was also stormed. Obviously, the uprisings in each of Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Nepal have their differences. Sri Lanka's protests were driven by anger at the government's mismanagement of the country's economic crisis. Bangladeshi students were protesting against a quota system for government jobs, and the immediate trigger for the Nepalese protests was the social media ban. But crucially, in all of these cases, the protest tapped into deep-rooted frustration at endemic corruption, poor economic opportunities, and bad governance. Young people and social media played critical roles. The protests were largely separate from organised political parties, and government crackdowns, including with lethal force and social media restrictions, ended up galvanising the movements instead. The aftermath of both the Bangladeshi and Nepalese uprisings also bear similarities. In both cases, the youth-led protest movements put forward conspicuously non-youthful people to lead the countries out of the turmoil. 73-year-old Sushila Karki in Nepal, and 84-year-old economist Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. This is a reflection of the fact that grassroots, somewhat leaderless mass movements unaffiliated with parties face a considerable challenge after toppling a government. As they don't have any established political infrastructure, turning to elders adjacent to but outside of politics seems to be a sensible choice in the short term. Subsequent elections then provide an opportunity for political and generational change. In Sri Lanka, for instance, the old guard was swept away at the 2024 elections, with Anura Kumara Dissanayake becoming the first third-party candidate to be elected president. When Nepal votes next year, it may look to relative outsiders too. For example, rapper turned mayor of Kathmandu, Balan Shah. But beyond Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Nepal, this Gen Z-driven so-called South Asian Spring has in fact spread further, particularly into Southeast Asia. Indonesia was rocked by protests in August amid economic frustration and anger at politicians' perks. The Philippines saw its own Nepo babies online trend, and recent mass protests against corruption and billions of dollars lost to bogus flood relief projects. While in Timor-Leste, last week, university students led anti-corruption protests demanding plans to buy a fleet of SUVs for lawmakers be scrapped. Threads can also be drawn between all of these, whether it's the prevalence of the one-piece flag as a protest symbol and the leading role played by Gen Z, the underlying frustration at corruption and inequality, and the use of social media to drive these feelings, organise demonstrations, and inspire and share solidarity with those doing the same in other countries. Given the febrile atmosphere in the region, it's no surprise that the governments of Indonesia and Timor-Leste have agreed to many of their respective protesters' demands in bids to quell unrest. While in the Philippines, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who, as the child of a notoriously corrupt former dictator, is perhaps the ultimate Nepo baby, has sought to align himself with the protesters, saying he shares their anger at the flood relief-related corruption and has ordered an independent investigation. This is certainly not the first wave of protests in which social media has played an important role. There's a lot to be said about the importance of the internet in the mass protests of the 2010s, from the Arab Spring to Brazil to Turkey to Hong Kong to Thailand. But we are now more online and more connected than ever, and information now travels faster than ever. So until the root causes of things like corruption and economic inequality are dealt with, it won't take much to inspire mass movements to spring up elsewhere. The media landscape right now is moving so fast that it's quite easy to just rely on the information you already know, or the sources you've grown to trust. But what about everything you don't see? Or what if those sources you trust aren't completely honest? Luckily, our sponsor this week, Ground News, are experts at lifting the veil on media bias. Their website and app, developed by a former NASA engineer, collects thousands of articles from across the media landscape, putting them all into one place for you to easily compare how the news is being covered around the world. For example, this story on Nepal's interim Prime Minister setting the date for new elections has been covered by 183 sources, with 32 reported by the left and 21 reported by the right. That's not all though, as Ground News offers a bunch of super handy features. We especially like their blind spot feed, as here you can see stories that have been disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. For example, if you lean left, you might have missed this story about Argentina's president meeting with Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu in New York. It's important to know exactly what's circulating online in different echo chambers, instead of purposefully choosing to stay in the dark. We all know that the current media sphere is always trying to get your attention by any means necessary to sway you into thinking one thing or